After 11 years in the same company, you stop expecting surprises. You learn the rhythms, the patterns, the way decisions usually arrive long before they're announced. You also learn when something feels off, even if no one has said it out loud yet. The meeting invite came from my boss early that morning. Subject line, quick catch-up. No agenda, no attachments, just 15 minutes blocked right before his weekly sync with senior management. That alone told me this wasn't about feedback. I joined the call on time, camera on, posture straight. Same desk, same office, same view I'd had for years. I'd spent more than a decade building things from that chair. Projects, teams, systems that quietly kept the company running while leadership rotated above me. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't thank me for joining. He looked directly into the camera and said, "I'll get straight to the point." That sentence always lands heavy, no matter how many times you hear it. "We've decided to move in a different direction," he continued. His voice was calm, confident, almost rehearsed. "We found someone who's a better fit for what we need right now." I let the silence sit for a moment, just long enough to be sure he wasn't going to add context on his own. "A better fit," I repeated. He nodded. "Yes, more aligned with where we're going." I waited. There was no explanation. No mention of performance issues, no reference to missed targets or failed projects, just a vague phrase in a firm tone. "Today will be your last day," he said. 11 years. That was how long I'd been there. Through leadership changes, restructures, cost-cutting cycles that came and went every few years. I had stayed when others left. I'd absorbed responsibilities when roles were eliminated. I'd become the person people called when something broke and no one else knew how to fix it. And now, apparently, I was no longer aligned. "This isn't about performance," he added, almost anticipating the question. "You've done solid work. This is a strategic decision." Strategic. That word has a way of ending conversations before they begin. I glanced at the screen. No HR representative, no legal, just him delivering a decision that sounded final because he needed it to be final. "So there's no discussion?" I asked. He smiled, the way managers do when they believe authority alone should be sufficient. "No," he said. "The decision's been made." I nodded once. I didn't argue. I didn't remind him of the systems I still maintained or the projects that were midstream. I didn't list achievements or point out risks. Years in corporate environments teach you that once someone frames a decision as strategic, they're not looking for input. They're looking for compliance. "We'll coordinate access later today," he continued. "IT will reach out. You can take the afternoon to wrap up personal items." Wrap up. As if 11 years could be boxed in a few hours. Before ending the call, he added one last sentence. "I want to be clear," he said. "This isn't personal. We just found someone better." Better. The word hung there for a second longer than the rest. "I understand," I said. That seemed to satisfy him. He nodded, thanked me for my time, and ended the call. The screen went dark. I stayed seated, staring at my own reflection in the monitor. Not angry, not shocked, just aware of how quickly certainty had replaced consideration. What struck me most wasn't the decision itself, it was how confident he'd been making it, how sure he was that this was his call to make, and his alone. At that moment, I assumed he knew something I didn't. I didn't yet realize that he hadn't checked upward, and that detail would matter later. I didn't join the company expecting to stay for 11 years. No one does. It started as a role I thought I'd hold for a few years, build experience, then move on. But things have a way of changing when responsibility grows quietly and trust follows it. When I arrived, the company was smaller, fewer layers, fewer processes. People wore multiple hats, and mistakes were visible because there was nowhere to hide them. That's where I learned how things actually worked, not how they were described in presentations. Over time, my role evolved, not through promotions announced in town halls, but through necessity. When a project stalled, it landed on my desk. When two teams disagreed on ownership, I was asked to just take care of it. When something critical broke outside business hours, my phone was the one that rang. I wasn't the loudest person in the room. I didn't compete for attention. I became useful in a way that doesn't show up neatly on org charts. By year 4, I was no longer just executing tasks. I was coordinating between departments that didn't fully trust each other. By year 6, I was the person leadership turned to when timelines slipped and explanations were needed. By year 8, people stopped asking if I could handle something and started assuming I already was. None of this came with a dramatic title change. It came with access, with quiet authority, with being looped into conversations others weren't. That kind of position builds slowly. It's not flashy, but it's fragile. It exists because people believe you understand the system better than most and won't misuse that understanding. Senior management knew my name, not because I sought visibility, but because my work intersected with outcomes they cared about. Revenue projections, operational continuity, risk reduction that never made it into reports because nothing went wrong. When leadership changed, I stayed. When strategy shifted, I adapted. When budgets tightened, I absorbed more with less noise. I became part of the company's institutional memory, the kind that doesn't live in documents. My boss knew all of this. He'd inherited me from a previous manager and early on made it clear he valued stability. He often spoke about protecting the core and not disrupting what works. For years, that included me, which is why the speed of his decision caught me off guard. There was no gradual distancing, no warnings, no performance conversations hinting at dissatisfaction. One meeting, one phrase, and 11 years were suddenly framed as misalignment. What made it more unsettling was how incomplete the decision felt. He spoke confidently, but he didn't reference discussions with anyone else. He didn't mention senior management reviews or broader alignment. He didn't ask about transition risks or continuity. It felt like a decision made in isolation, wrapped in corporate language to give it weight. In the days leading up to that meeting, I'd still been involved in planning conversations, still receiving requests, still being asked for input on issues that didn't have clean answers. Nothing in my workload suggested I was being phased out, and yet, according to my boss, I was already gone. That disconnect lingered. If this had truly been a strategic shift endorsed at higher levels, there would have been signals, questions, preparatory steps, at the very least, a coordinated message. Instead, there was just his confidence, the kind that comes from believing authority flows downward, not upward. I didn't question him. I didn't challenge the logic. But as I sat there, replaying the conversation in my head, one thought kept returning. Decisions that affect this much usually travel through more than one set of hands, and this one hadn't felt like it did. The hours after the call passed quietly, but the pressure showed up in subtler ways, not through confrontation, but through process, through small, deliberate actions that made it clear the decision wasn't just final, it was meant to be absorbed without resistance. Within an hour, I received a follow-up email from my boss. Short, polite, carefully worded. It outlined next steps and emphasized the importance of a smooth transition. There was an attachment listing items he expected documented before the end of the day. It wasn't new work, it was everything I already carried in my head. There was no mention of time constraints, but the implication was clear. Whatever knowledge I had built over 11 years was now something to be extracted quickly and neatly, without friction. Another message followed shortly after. This one CC'd IT and HR. Access changes were scheduled, not immediate but staged, enough to keep me functional but aware that the window was closing. My boss stopped by my office mid-afternoon, not to talk, to observe. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room as if taking inventory. "Let me know if you need help prioritizing," he said. "We want to make sure nothing critical slips." I nodded. He waited a moment, perhaps expecting a reaction, a question, a pushback. None came. His tone shifted slightly. "I know this is a lot to process, but it's important we stay aligned on expectations." Aligned. The same word he'd used to justify the decision, now repurposed to enforce compliance. Later that day, I was added to a shared document labeled Transition Plan. It listed names next to responsibilities, many of which were loosely defined. Some belonged to people who had never worked closely with me before. The document framed everything as already settled: ownership reassigned, processes redistributed, timelines compressed. No one asked if the assumptions made sense. No one asked what might be missing. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't need to be. The pressure was structural, not emotional. The message was simple: finish what we ask, don't complicate things, and leave quietly. My boss checked in again before the end of the day. This time his voice carried a different edge, less rehearsed, more directive. "Just so we're clear," he said, "this needs to be wrapped up today. Senior management wants closure." That was the first time he mentioned them directly. I noticed how he phrased it. Not "we discussed this," not "they reviewed this," just "they want closure." It sounded less like alignment and more like insulation. I acknowledged the request without comment. As the afternoon stretched on, the requests continued. Clarifications, follow-ups, subtle reminders of deadlines. Each one framed as reasonable on its own, but together they formed a pattern. They wanted certainty, quickly. At one point, my boss asked me to forward a folder containing internal notes I'd maintained for years. Notes that weren't formal documentation, but reflections, context, the why behind decisions that never made it into official records. "These would help whoever takes over," he said. I paused for a moment before responding. Then I agreed to review what could be shared. He accepted that answer without pressing, but the look on his face suggested impatience, the kind that comes when someone expects cooperation to be automatic. There were no threats, no raised voices, no ultimatums, just assumptions. Assumptions that I would rush, that I would over-explain, that I would compress years of judgment into bullet points because the org chart now said I should. By the end of the day, it was clear that my role had already been reduced to a checklist, not because it accurately reflected what I did, but because it was easier to manage that way. I didn't correct them. I didn't warn anyone about gaps or dependencies that weren't obvious. I followed instructions, carefully, precisely. And as I did, one thing became increasingly clear. The pressure wasn't about making the transition successful, it was about making the decision irreversible, and that told me more than anything else could. By the next morning, the noise had settled into a steady hum. Messages still came in, but they were fewer now. The urgency had shifted from extraction to assumption. They believed they had what they needed. I arrived early, as I always had. Same routine, same coffee, same quiet floor before the rest of the building filled in. It felt familiar, almost comforting, which made the contrast sharper. I opened the transition document again and read through it slowly. Lines had been added overnight, owners reassigned, deadlines confirmed. There was confidence in the wording, as if the hard part was already over. That was when I noticed what wasn't there. There was no mention of escalation paths, no fallback contacts, no acknowledgement of the informal bridges I'd built between teams that didn't formally report to one another. The document assumed the system was linear, clean, predictable. It never had been. My boss sent a short message around 9. "Just checking in. We're on track, right?" I replied with a single sentence, "I'm following the plan." It was true. Around mid-morning, IT scheduled the final access change. The time was listed plainly, like any other calendar entry. No explanation needed. The implication was enough. I took a moment before accepting the invite, not to resist it, but to acknowledge what it meant. After that time, my role would no longer exist in practice, only in memory. I spent the next hour organizing my workspace, not because anyone had asked, but because it felt appropriate. Files sorted, notes closed, personal items packed carefully, without haste. There was no dramatic moment, no final speech, just the quiet completion of a routine I'd performed for years. Shortly before the access cut off, another message came through. This one from my boss again. "Before you go," he wrote, "can you send over the internal notes you mentioned yesterday, the ones you keep separately?" I read it twice. Those notes weren't secrets. They weren't proprietary tricks. They were context, judgment calls, the reasoning behind decisions that couldn't be reduced to diagrams. They existed because some things only make sense when you understand how fragile certain balances are. I typed a response, then deleted it. Typed again, deleted again. In the end, I wrote, "I've shared everything outlined in the transition plan." There was a pause. A few minutes later, he replied, "Those notes would really help." I didn't respond immediately, not out of spite, but out of clarity. The transition plan was their framework, their definition of what mattered. I had agreed to operate within it. I sent one final message. "I'm comfortable with what's been provided." That was the decision. Not loud, not defiant, just complete. At noon, my access changed. Email logged out, internal tools closed, dashboards went dark. It happened exactly as scheduled, without ceremony. I stood up, looked around the office one last time, and realized something unexpected. There was relief, not because I felt vindicated, but because the weight of maintaining an invisible system had lifted. Whatever happened next would unfold without my intervention. I left the building quietly, badge turned in at the desk downstairs. The guard nodded, unaware of the significance. To him, it was just another exit. Outside, the day continued as if nothing had changed. Traffic moved, people hurried past. The company still stood, lights on, confident in its processes. As I walked away, my phone buzzed once. A message preview from my boss appeared on the screen. "We may need to talk later," it read. I didn't open it. The turning point wasn't the message or the silence that followed. It was the moment I stopped being part of the system that had depended on me without ever naming it. I had made one calm choice, and from that point on, whatever happened would no longer be something I needed to manage. The first signs came quietly. Not alarms or urgent calls, but delays, meetings that ended without decisions, emails marked following up that received no reply, tasks reassigned without clarity, small gaps that didn't seem serious on their own. 2 days after I left, a former colleague messaged me privately, not asking for help, just asking if I was doing okay. That alone told me more than any official update could have. By the end of the week, the tone shifted. Requests started bouncing between teams. Ownership wasn't clear. People assumed someone else had context. The transition document was opened often, but rarely updated. It listed steps, not judgment. On Monday morning, senior management joined a standing operational review they normally skipped. That was unusual. They asked questions that didn't have clean answers. Why timelines had moved, why certain metrics looked off, why approvals were stalled. My boss spoke first. He sounded confident, but the confidence was thinner now. He referenced the transition plan. He explained that responsibilities had been redistributed. "What about escalation?" someone asked. There was a pause. He answered with a name that wasn't in the room. The meeting ended without resolution. Later that day, I heard that a routine process had failed. Not catastrophically, but enough to be noticed. A dependency no one had accounted for caused a delay that rippled outward. A report went out late. A client asked questions. Internally, people started retracing steps. They discovered that the assumptions in the transition plan didn't match reality. By Wednesday, senior management requested a separate review, not of the process, but of the decision. They wanted to understand what had been lost when the role was eliminated. That was when the numbers entered the conversation. Delays turned into penalties. Penalties turned into adjustments. Adjustments turned into forecasts that no longer lined up with commitments already made. One stalled deal, previously considered routine, missed its window. The opportunity didn't disappear, but the terms changed. Less favorable, more scrutiny, more hesitation. Another team reported increased costs. Temporary fixes layered over missing context required additional resources. Contractors were brought in to stabilize things. Their invoices arrived quickly. The financial impact wasn't dramatic all at once. It accumulated, quietly, exactly the way risk does when no one is actively managing it. By the next week, senior management asked to see documentation that didn't exist. Not because it had been withheld, but because it had never been written down in that form. Much of what I'd done lived between teams, in conversations and decisions that didn't translate cleanly into files. They asked who could explain those gaps. There wasn't an answer. At some point, my boss was asked directly why the decision had been made without broader review, why the role had been eliminated without consultation, why no contingency plan had been validated. He explained it as optimization, cost control, efficiency. Those words sounded different now. The losses became easier to quantify. Additional spend to cover delays, revenue pushed into future quarters, one partnership quietly downgraded from strategic to monitor. None of it was catastrophic, but none of it was acceptable either. Senior management requested a full breakdown, not of my performance, but of the impact of my absence. They wanted to see cause and effect, what had changed, what had stopped working, what now required extra effort to maintain. The answers pointed in one direction. My boss stopped copying me on messages, then stopped messaging altogether. A few weeks after I left, someone from finance reached out, not for assistance, for clarification. They wanted to understand why certain cost-saving assumptions hadn't materialized. I explained, briefly and factually, what I could from memory. No opinions, no commentary, just descriptions of how things had functioned. They thanked me and ended the call. The company adjusted its forecasts. Margins tightened. Questions were raised during leadership reviews, not about me, but about decision-making discipline. The phrase, unintended consequences, started appearing in summaries. By then, the damage was done. Not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that erodes confidence, internally, upward. Senior management didn't panic, they recalibrated. They asked harder questions. They examined who had made the call and how much validation it had received. The answer was uncomfortable. The decision that had been presented as strategic had never traveled far enough up the chain, and now the cost of that oversight was visible. Not because anyone had sabotaged anything, but because a system that relied on invisible coordination had been simplified until it broke. I didn't celebrate that realization. I watched it from a distance, aware that the outcome had followed naturally from the choices made. Cause had met effect, and the gap between them had finally closed. The call from senior management came later than I expected, not days but weeks after the initial questions began circulating. By then, the urgency had cooled into something more deliberate. They didn't ask me to come back. They didn't suggest reversing anything. The tone was measured, almost careful, as if they were walking around a fragile conclusion they'd already reached. They wanted clarity, not opinions, not justifications. They wanted to understand how certain decisions had been made and why the effects had spread the way they did. I answered simply. I described how work had flowed, where judgment had mattered more than documentation, which connections had existed informally because they had to. I avoided language that assigned blame. I didn't need to. When the conversation ended, there was a pause on the line, then a brief acknowledgement. "That helps," someone said. "Nothing more." I hung up and sat quietly for a moment, letting the room settle back into stillness. The place I was in now didn't look like my old office. Smaller, quieter, temporary by design. The company moved on, as companies always do. Processes were adjusted, roles redefined, additional oversight introduced. None of it dramatic enough to be public, but enough to be felt internally. My boss didn't reach out again. I heard, indirectly, that his authority had narrowed. Decisions that once passed unchallenged now traveled further up before being approved. His confidence remained, but it had edges now. Senior management didn't make announcements. They didn't issue corrections. They rarely do. Instead, they shifted expectations. They asked for validation where there hadn't been any before. They disagreed quietly, through structure rather than words. That disagreement was enough. As for me, I settled into a different rhythm. Work that ended when it was supposed to. Conversations that didn't carry hidden urgency. Responsibility that was clearly named, not implied. One evening, weeks later, I stopped at a small cafe near my place, the kind that closes early and doesn't rush you. I ordered, sat by the window, and watched people pass without thinking about who might call next. For the first time in a long while, there was nothing to manage, nothing to anticipate, nothing quietly depending on me without saying so. I took a sip of coffee and noticed how ordinary the moment felt. Not triumphant, not bitter, just complete. What stayed with me wasn't the decision to fire me or the fallout that followed. It was the realization that systems often rely on people they never formally protect. When those people are removed without care, the system reveals what it truly understood. Senior management had seen that, not loudly, not publicly, but clearly enough to change how decisions were made afterward. That was resolution enough. I finished my drink, gathered my things, and stepped back outside. The day was ending. The light was fading. Somewhere else, meetings were still happening, plans still forming. They would continue without me, and I was finally okay with that.